Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. The reason you love tuning in is because you're all about getting right to the heart of things. You crave those aha moments, but without overloading your brain. And today, we are going to deliver. We're going deep on something that's absolutely fundamental to how we think, how we make decisions, and yeah, sometimes how we trip ourselves up. We're talking about the two systems that drive our thinking.
You got it. And we have a fantastic guide for this journey, Daniel Kahneman, and his brilliant book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And this isn't just some ivory tower theory, by the way. Kahneman's work is so insightful, so impactful, it actually won him a Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
You know, the one in economic sciences? Yeah, that one. And it's had a huge ripple effect on how we understand psychology and behavioral economics.
And our goal for you today is pretty straightforward. We want to give you a solid grasp of these two systems. We call them System 1 and System 2, so you can see how they're constantly shaping your judgments and decisions. Consider this your shortcut to understanding this really crucial framework for understanding your own mind. So let's unpack this thing, starting with our brain's rapid response team. That's System 1. What can you tell us about that?
Well, you can think of System 1 as your brain's automatic pilot. It just operates instantly, without any real conscious effort or even a sense that you're controlling it. It's your intuition, those gut feelings, the immediate reactions you have before you even have time to think things through. This is what we call fast thinking, driven by instinct and shaped by a lifetime of experiences.
You know what? I think we all know that feeling of just reacting without even thinking, right? Can you give us some everyday examples?
Oh, absolutely. Imagine this. You're walking down a super crowded street, right? And all of a sudden, bam, you instantly recognize a friend's face way off in the distance. That's System 1 kicking in. Or maybe you're in the kitchen, not paying attention, and accidentally touch a scorching hot pan. Your hand jerks back even before you fully register the pain. See, that's your rapid-fire thinking system jumping into action to protect you. System 1 is constantly scanning your surroundings, picking up patterns, using mental shortcuts. We call those heuristics to make those split-second judgments and decisions. And the key takeaway here is that it all happens effortlessly. It's often operating beneath our conscious awareness.
So it's like our brain's seasoned expert making these quick calls based on what it's learned and done before, huh? Okay, well now let's switch gears to the more thoughtful, more deliberate side of things, our mental processes. This is where System 2 comes into play.
Yeah, System 2. That's where the real mental heavy lifting happens. It's deliberate, it takes effort, it's conscious. This is what you call slow thinking. This is the system that's working when you need to really concentrate, when you're tackling a complex problem or trying to follow a complicated argument. And unlike System 1, System 2 actually needs some fuel. It needs those cognitive resources. It's what you're using when you're carefully trying to balance your budget or learning a brand new, challenging skill.
So if System 1 is kind of like hitting the gas without even thinking, System 2 is like you're planning out your whole route carefully with a map.
You got it. A perfect analogy.
Yeah.
System 2 kicks in whenever we run into something new, something we haven't encountered before, or something that just needs some serious consideration. It's the part of you that actively analyzes information, that crunches numbers, that engages in logical reasoning step by step. It's the part we associate with problem solving and smarts, right? But there's a catch. System 2 is kind of like a muscle. It gets tired. You can't keep up that intense System 2 thinking forever.
So, okay, we got the speedy System 1, we got the methodical System 2. Sounds like a pretty good system, right? But I have a feeling that those System 1 shortcuts, the heuristics, I have a feeling those aren't always so reliable. Am I right?
You are absolutely right. While System 1's speed and efficiency are really valuable in lots of situations, those very shortcuts can also lead us astray. They introduce predictable errors into our judgment. We call these biases. And they're not just random mistakes, they're systematic patterns of flawed thinking that, honestly, we're all prone to.
Well, let's dive into some of those common mental traps then. What are some of the ones we should be looking out for? Let's start with anchoring. What is that exactly?
Oh, anchoring is fascinating. It's this bias where we tend to over-rely on the very first piece of information we get, the anchor, when we're making decisions. And here's the kicker. Even if that information isn't really all that relevant or reliable, it's like our minds get kind of fixated on that first number, that first data point, and throws everything else off.
So how does that actually play out in our everyday lives? Give us an example, a practical one, something we can all relate to.
Okay, imagine you're in the market for a new smartphone. You're doing your research, and the very first price you see advertised is, let's say, $1,200. Now, even if you later find other phones that are practically the same, but for $1,000, that initial $1,200 figure, it's already stuck in your mind, right? It's set the anchor. So when you see a phone for, say, $1,100, it might feel like a steal, a really good deal, compared to that $1,200, even though $1,000 might actually be the real fair price. The key is that this initial piece of information, often totally arbitrary, it can really warp our sense of value.
Wow, yeah, I see that. That's a good one. I can definitely see how that happens, not just with phones, but in all sorts of situations.
Uh,
What's another one of these mental gremlins we should be aware of?
Well, there's something called the availability heuristic. This is where we base our judgments on how easily examples come to mind. If something is really vivid, if it happened recently, or if it had a strong emotional impact, we tend to think it happens more often than it really does. We overestimate its frequency or probability.
So, like, if we've just seen something dramatic on the news, that might mess with our sense of how common it actually is?
Exactly. Like shark attacks, for example. Of course, they're scary, but statistically, they're incredibly rare. But because those stories are often so sensationalized and they get a ton of media coverage, the availability heuristic might lead us to think, whoa, shark attacks happen all the time,
Hmm.
compared to, say, car accidents, which are statistically far more likely, but they don't get that same dramatic over-the-top coverage. The takeaway here is that what's easy to recall isn't always an accurate reflection of what's most likely to happen.
That's such a good point. Really highlights how our fears can be so out of whack with the real risks. Okay, so we've covered anchoring, we've covered availability. What about this concept of substitution? I'm curious about that one.
Oh, substitution. That's a sneaky one. Substitution happens when we're faced with a question that's tough, maybe a bit complex, and our system one brain, our intuitive brain, it just subtly swaps it out for an easier, more related question. We don't even realize it's happening. And then we answer that simpler question, and we think we've answered the original one, the harder one.
I think an example would really help here. Can you give us a concrete scenario where this substitution thing is happening?
Okay, let's say someone asks you, how happy are you with your life these days? That's a pretty deep question, right? It's multifaceted. It requires some real introspection. But instead of wrestling with that, your system one might swap it out for something like, how's your mood right now? Or how satisfied are you with your social life lately? So you end up answering that easier question based on how you're feeling right this second or what you've been up to recently. And that immediate response, it colors your whole assessment of your life satisfaction, even though there might be a bunch of other crucial factors at play that you're not even considering. The point is, the answer you give might not actually be addressing the real question that was asked.
Man, our brains are sneaky. It's like they're taking these mental shortcuts to dodge the hard work. Okay, so a theme I'm picking up on here is this idea of overconfidence. It seems like, as humans, we just tend to think we know more than we actually do. What do you think?
You are spot on. Overconfidence is everywhere. It's a bias where we tend to overestimate how accurate our knowledge is, how much we know, and how reliable our judgments are. We have this natural inclination to believe we're more skilled, more informed, more likely to succeed than the evidence actually supports.
So, how does all this overconfidence affect the decisions we make in the real world? What's the impact?
Well, it can lead to all kinds of problems, to be honest. For example, we might be way too confident in our ability to predict the future. Like how well a certain stock will do, or whether a business venture will succeed, or even the outcome of a relationship. And that inflated sense of certainty, well, it can lead to risky decisions. We don't plan as well as we should, and we fail to consider the downsides, the things that could go wrong. Overconfidence, it basically blinds us to our own limitations.
And it sounds like overconfidence can get tangled up with something called confirmation bias, right? How do those two play off each other?
Yeah, they often work hand in hand like partners in crime. Confirmation bias is our tendency to seek out information and interpret it in a way that just reinforces what we already believe. That's like we're building an echo chamber in our own minds, and we conveniently ignore or dismiss any information that challenges those beliefs. So if we're already feeling super confident in our initial judgment, we're even more likely to just focus on evidence that supports our view and to tune out anything that contradicts it. This just strengthens our overconfidence, even if our initial judgment was totally off base. And this combo, it's especially dangerous because it makes it really, really hard to learn from our mistakes.
So overconfidence makes us think we're right, and confirmation bias stops us from seeing the signs that we might actually be wrong.
Yeah, that's a pretty powerful barrier to good decision-making. Let's dig a little deeper into how this overconfidence shows up in our lives. Let's start with this concept of the illusion of validity. What is that all about? The illusion of validity is that unshakable feeling of confidence in our predictions and judgments, even when we have a pile of evidence suggesting that our predictions, well, they aren't very accurate. We might genuinely feel like we deeply understand a situation and that we can make reliable forecasts. Kahneman's research, it shows that our gut feeling, our subjective confidence, it's not a very good indicator of how accurate we actually are.
So even if we've got a lot of data, a lot of experience under our belt, we can still fall for this illusion.
You bet. We humans, we're natural-born pattern seekers. We love to find connections and create these neat and tidy narratives, even when events are largely random, just driven by chance. And this can lead us to think we understand things, that we can predict outcomes with far more certainty than we actually can. And this, of course, just feeds the illusion of validity. The crucial takeaway here is that just because we've woven a compelling story, it doesn't mean our prediction is actually going to be right.
And this all ties in with the planning fallacy, right? I know I've definitely fallen for that one before, haven't you?
Right. Oh yeah, the planning fallacy. We all have. It's our tendency to underestimate how long it'll take us to do something, to finish a task, even when we've got tons of past experience telling us that similar tasks have always taken longer than we thought. It's like we focus only on the best-case scenario, the perfect sequence of events, and completely ignore all the potential delays, all the unexpected hiccups that always seem to pop up. You know, good old Murphy's Law.
It's like we always think this time will be different, even though our past experience is screaming at us, no, it won't.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We fall in love with those best-case projections, but we forget about the messy reality of actually getting things done. And then, of course, there's regression to the mean, another tricky statistical concept that our intuitive System 1 brain really struggles to get.
Break it down for us. What's regression to the mean? It sounds kind of technical.
It is a bit technical, but it's important. It's a statistical phenomenon that says if a data point is unusually high or low, the next data point from the same source is probably going to be closer to the average. Imagine test scores, for instance. If a student gets an incredibly high score on one exam, it's likely their next score will be a bit lower, closer to their average performance.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean they slacked off or didn't study as hard. It's just a statistical tendency. Things tend to even out over time.
So how do we often get this wrong? How do we misinterpret it?
We often try to pin that shift back to the average on something specific, some kind of intervention or cause. Like, if a student aced their first test and then does a little worse on the second one after their teacher praised them, the teacher might think, oh, praising students leads to worse performance. They've missed the fact that extreme scores tend to naturally move back towards the average. It's also related to what we call the halo effect, where if someone's great at one thing, we assume they'll be great at everything, and then we're surprised when they're not. The key is to remember that chance and natural variation play a huge role, and we don't need to find a specific cause for every little change.
Right. So our biases, a tendency to be overconfident, they can really distort our understanding of things and lead to some pretty bad decisions. So let's shift gears a bit now and talk about how these cognitive quirks actually influence the choices we make each and every day. Let's start with loss aversion. This one sounds like a biggie.
Oh, it is. Loss aversion is a powerful force. It's basically the principle that the pain of losing something hits us way harder psychologically than the pleasure of gaining something of the same value. Like, finding $100 on the street feels good, sure, but losing $100, oof, that feels way worse. Maybe even twice as bad.
So the negative feelings that come with a loss, they outweigh the positive feelings of an equal gain.
Exactly. Research backs this up over and over again. This asymmetry between gains and losses, it really affects how we make decisions. For example, people might hang on to an investment that's losing money, hoping it'll eventually bounce back, simply because the thought of taking that loss is too painful. Even if, objectively, selling it and putting that money somewhere else would be the smarter move financially. Our fear of loss, it can drive us to make choices that just don't make sense.
That's so relatable. I think we've all been there, hanging on to something that's clearly not working just to avoid admitting we made a mistake or lost out. And this brings us to prospect theory, right? You mentioned it earlier. How does prospect theory build on this whole idea of loss aversion?
Prospect theory, which was developed by Kahneman and Amos Tversky, it was a game changer. It revolutionized how we understand decision-making when risk and uncertainty are involved. It challenged this old economic idea that people make decisions based on absolute wealth or expected utility. Prospect theory says we actually evaluate potential gains and losses relative to a reference point, usually our current situation or what we were expecting would happen. And importantly, just like we've been talking about, the theory factors in loss aversion, showing how the potential for losses carries a lot more weight in our decision-making than the potential for gains of the same size. This helps explain why we often do things that seem totally irrational from a purely logical or economic standpoint.
So it's not just about the final result, it's about whether we see that outcome as a win or a loss from our own personal starting point.
Exactly. And this framework helps explain a lot of seemingly illogical behaviors, like why someone might be more willing to take a big gamble to try to recover a loss than they would be to make the same bet if they didn't have anything to lose in the first place. The sting of that initial loss, it really skews how we perceive risk.
That's so insightful. Now, another thing that seems to affect our choices in a big way is how options are presented to us, the way things are framed. Tell us about framing effects.
Framing effects show how the way information is presented can have a huge impact on our decisions, even if the underlying facts are exactly the same. Just little tweaks in the wording or where the emphasis is placed, they can nudge us to make very different choices.
Earlier, you gave that example about medical treatment. Can you remind us how framing can sway decisions in a medical context?
Of course, imagine a doctor describing the outcomes of a certain medical treatment. Option A is framed positively. It's got a 90% survival rate. That's good, right? Now, option B, same exact outcome, but it's framed negatively. It's got a 10% mortality rate. And even though these two statements are saying the exact same thing, conveying the exact same probability of success, people are much more likely to go for the treatment when it's framed in terms of survival, potential gain, as opposed to mortality, a potential loss. The way it's framed plays right into our loss aversion, even though the objective result is identical. This shows just how easily our choices can be manipulated by how information is presented.
That's a great example. It's also a little unsettling, to be honest, how much presentation can influence us. Okay, we're heading into the final stretch of our deep dive now, and I'm really intrigued by this idea of the two selves. What exactly are these two selves you're talking about?
Well, Kahneman suggests that we actually have two distinct selves that shape how we experience and remember our lives. They're called the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self is the part of you that's living in the moment, right here, right now. It's constantly taking in feelings, sensations, those pleasures and discomforts as they happen. It's all about your immediate well-being in the present moment. It's the answer to the question, how do you feel at this very second?
So that's the self that's feeling the warmth of a nice cup of coffee or the frustration of being stuck in traffic.
That's the one. It's the one living in the present moment. But the remembering self, now that's the one that looks back on our past experiences. It's the storyteller, the one that creates the narrative of our lives, weaving together all the things we've done and been through. And here's the fascinating part. The remembering self doesn't just take an average of all those moments the experiencing self lived through. It plays by a different set of rules.
So our memories are more like what? Carefully edited highlight reels than complete recordings.
Exactly. The remembering self tends to focus on certain moments way more than others, especially the peak intensity of an experience, whether it was super positive or super negative. And then the very end of the experience. This is something Kahneman calls the peak end rule. And it's kind of wild, but how long the experience actually lasted often has surprisingly little impact on how the remembering self evaluates it.
That's so counterintuitive. So a short but really amazing experience might actually be remembered more fondly than a much longer but kind of uneventful one.
Exactly. And this disconnect between the experiencing self and the remembering self, it has huge implications for the choices we make. Think about it. We often make decisions based on how we think we'll remember an experience in the future, rather than focusing on what will actually make us feel good moment to moment. So we might go through a painful medical procedure if we think it'll make a good story later, or we might prioritize a lavish vacation for the sake of the memories, even if the actual trip is a bit stressful.
Wow, that's a lot to think about. So we could be living our lives trying to create good stories for our remembering self, even if it means our experiencing self isn't as happy in the present moment.
That's exactly it. And understanding this difference can really make you reevaluate your priorities, what's truly important to you. It raises a really important question. Are we living for the experience itself? Or are we living for the memory of the experience?
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive into the two systems of thinking. Just to recap, we've explored System 1, the automatic, intuitive one, and System 2, the deliberate, effortful one. We saw how System 1's reliance on those mental shortcuts, like anchoring, availability, and substitution, they can lead to systematic biases in our thinking. We also explored this idea of overconfidence, the illusion of validity, the planning fallacy, and regression to the mean. And then we shifted gears and looked at how loss aversion and framing effects influence the choices we make, all through the lens of prospect theory. And finally, we unpack the fascinating difference between our experiencing and remembering selves. Phew.
And I think the big takeaway here is that by becoming more aware of these two systems and being mindful of the ways our intuitive thinking can trip us up, we can become better thinkers, more effective decision makers. Recognizing when system one might be steering us wrong is the first step toward more rational thinking.
I totally agree. So, to our listeners, I want you to take some time this week to think about how these two systems might be playing out in your own lives, in the choices you make each and every day, big ones and small ones. Are there any areas where you might be a little too influenced by an initial anchor? Have you ever overestimated how likely something is to happen just because it popped into your mind really easily? Have you?
And maybe the most interesting question of all, think about this. How could a better understanding of the needs and priorities of your remembering self versus your experiencing self affect how you choose to spend your time and how you seek out fulfillment? Are you, maybe without even realizing it, sacrificing some of your present enjoyment for the sake of a future memory? That's a really powerful question to consider as you go through your days and strive for both happiness and those lasting memories.